Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. This is day 42 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and I'm bringing this report from a new undisclosed location. I'm in the course of a move, so this is just a temporary situation until I get settled over the next week or two. Anyway, it's also significant perhaps that I'm in rural Nova Scotia as I'm speaking to you. One of the two panel discussions today was focused, at least ostensibly, on rural communities, the policing and crime scenarios individual to or differentiated from policing of urban centers. We'll come to that in a little bit. Day 42 of the Mass Casualty Commission had two panel discussions, but started off with an announcement from Chief Commissioner, Lead Commissioner Michael McDonald about a witness schedule, key witnesses that are scheduled to testify this summer in the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. And so I want to talk a little bit about that first, and then I'll talk about the two panel discussions. There was a panel discussion in the morning focused on the needs of first responders after mass casualty incidents, and then the second one in the afternoon dealt with rural communities, policing, and crime. Okay, so we'll come to those, but first the witnesses. So we now know that Lisa Banfield, spouse of the gunman, is going to testify on July 15th, so just in a couple of weeks' time. You'll notice that there's only one day associated with that testimony. RCMP Superintendent Darren Campbell, who's been in the news a lot in the last week, is going to testify July 25th and 26th. Chief Superintendent Chris Leather, who is part of the early press conferences from the RCMP in Nova Scotia, is going to testify July 27th and 28th. Assistant Commissioner Lee Bergerman, who was the head of the RCMP in Nova Scotia during the events of the mass casualty, and who announced her retirement as of last October when the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings were set to begin, is going to testify August 22nd and 23rd. Also on August 23rd and 24th is going to be RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, National Commissioner Brenda Lucki, who's also, of course, been in the news a fair amount in the last week or so. I've spoken about these in different interviews that I've done and talked about those in my last few pieces. Certainly the political controversy surrounding Commissioner Lucki, the lead RCMP officers in Nova Scotia, isn't going to go away anytime soon. And it'll be very interesting to hear that testimony. It's unfortunate that we have to wait till the end of August to hear from Assistant Commissioner Bergerman and Commissioner Lucki. I would have thought they would have been able to fit those witnesses in a little earlier, but so it goes. In the meantime, we may actually hear from Commissioner Lucki in a parliamentary committee which is seeking to hear from the people involved in the alleged political pressure from the Prime Minister through the Minister of Public Safety and down through Commissioner Lucki into the Nova Scotia RCMP. Much of that pressure may have been very appropriate considering the performance of the RCMP in Nova Scotia is certainly on the leadership level. But the key to all of this is the announcement of the testimony of Lisa Banfield, or the most important part of it, in my view. Two things about it. One is it's only one day, July 15th, whereas others who had arguably much less important roles in this are being asked or demanded to testify over the course of 2 days. Commissioner McDonald, by the way, noted that each one of these witnesses are here subject to subpoena. Not that they were asked to come and didn't, but that they were all issued subpoenas so that they will be here. But that's significant in Miss Banfield's case because, which I'll come to in a moment. Now, she is only going to be on the stand for 1 day, and that's not a lot of time, really, when you're talking about a key witness. Lived with the killer for 19 years, was the last person with him before he started his rampage, all of those things, you could imagine somebody testifying for several days about all of that, his criminal background, her knowledge of all those things, what led him to set off like this as he did. The other part, and just as important, probably more important really, is that the questions for Miss Banfield are going to be asked only by Mass Casualty Commission lawyers or lawyer. By the way, it'll be very interesting to see which of their lawyers is chosen. Certainly, Roger Burrell seems to be doing much of the presentations and some of the questioning. Maybe it'll be Anna Mancini, could be Emily Hill. We'll see who may get the call for the Mass Casualty Commission. Be a lot of pressure on them because they're going to be the only lawyer asking questions. There will be no cross-examination, and this has already generated quite a bit of negative feedback from the participants. Patterson Law, who represents most of the families affected, has already issued a statement saying that this decision undermines the legitimacy of the Mass Casualty Commission process, which is certainly true. Miss Banfield, they say, has given 5 statements. And it was really interesting that the commissioner statement that was released really tries to portray her testimony as a glass half full situation, as though if 0 was not testifying at all and 10 is coming in and testifying at length and being cross-examined, it's almost as if the commission is thinking, well, we could have had nothing, but at least we have something, which really undersells the leverage that the commission has over potential witnesses and oversells Miss Banfield's her ability to avoid this testimony if she so chose to do so. Now, they put it this way. They say, well, she's already given 5 interviews to the Mass Casualty Commission. Not clear whether that includes the interviews that she gave before the restorative justice process, which is almost 4 months ago now that she engaged in the restorative justice process, had her criminal charges of supplying ammunition to Gabriel Wortman, her spouse, dropped as a result. Well, we don't think they've been dropped yet. The restorative justice normally what happen is this. Your charges go into court, you agree to restorative justice, you go undertake whatever process, and then come back to court and have the charges dropped. So we haven't had any indication that those charges have actually been withdrawn as would normally be the case. So we'll wait to hear about that specifically. But what the commission says is, well, she's given 5 interviews, but we still think it's necessary to hear from her directly. As if that was a question, as if giving interviews to the commission under controlled circumstances, presumably with her lawyer present, is anything of a substitute for giving witness testimony in a public setting with cross-examination. I mean, really giving the testimony under the circumstances described, other than the fact that it will be videotaped and available for us to watch, isn't going to be very different than giving an interview to commission lawyers. So we'll see how that goes. Now, the distinction is that the participants' lawyers, and by the way, again, a little disingenuous of the commission. They say, well, there are 61 participants, as though to say, well, we couldn't possibly have all of this cross-examination with 61 participants. No, misleading, because not all 61 of those participants would have standing to cross-examine Ms. Banfield. Some would be absolutely in their interest to cross-examine her. Most of the family participants, certainly, some of the the domestic violence groups would certainly have an interest in talking to her. But they say, well, there's 61 participants. They'll have a chance to submit questions in advance to commission lawyers. They'll also have two chances during the day when she's being questioned to caucus, to meet, to propose further questions. I'll be very curious to see how this goes, because really 7 or 8 hours over the course of a day, yes, well, you're going to take an hour for lunch, you're going to have these 2 meetings. Those aren't quick meetings typically. I wouldn't be surprised if they took half an hour or an hour each. So it doesn't leave a lot of time for Ms. Banfield to be on the stand. Now, if you were doing an effective cross-examination, you wouldn't need a whole lot of time, but I can guarantee what's going to happen is there'll be all these questions, these very pre-prepared, clear questions that Ms. Banfield is expecting, and she'll give her rehearsed answers, and that'll take up most of the time. And the very difficult questions, if there are any, will be asked near the end. Now, I say this puts pressure on the lawyer that's going to be acting for the Mass Casualty Commission. This could go one of two ways. One is that, well, since there's no cross-examination, that puts the more pressure on me to ask those kind of questions and be a little tough about it and probe into areas if it looks like she's being evasive, or if she says something and that prompts another question, well, I'll follow up on it. That would normally be what you would expect. But the fact that there's not going to be cross-examination and that she's going to have two support people with her, she's allowed to have two support people with her as part of the statement as well, says, well, this is the commission giving a very trauma-informed, accommodating, stance to this. So I wouldn't be surprised if the questions actually reflect that rather than the pressure to do both direct and cross-examination in one person. I think this will be a very gentle questioning. I don't think we're going to learn nearly as much as we could, and I agree with Patterson Law that it undermines the process. This is really what, it's been building to this in a way with all of the different decisions that the commission's been making, the statements they're making. They've been coming down to this. The key witness is going to be treated very gently, and we're not going to get the information that you might expect with vigorous cross-examination. So that'll be interesting. Another interesting aspect of the statement that came out today is the commission. Again, I think we're seeing a disconnect between the commissioners, the three of them, and the commission lawyers, because the commission has said that the commission counsel are there to represent the public interest, and that they're going to ask questions on behalf of participant counsel. By the way, in the statement, they don't say directly that there's not going to be cross-examination. They say that the commission counsel will question Ms. Banfield, quote, in their role representing the public interest and on behalf of participant counsel, which is a funny way to put it, really. I mean, what you're saying is that, anyway, there's not going to be cross-examination, but they don't use that phrase in there anywhere. So we'll see what comes out of that. But I think there's going to be even more criticism. So, but what I see is the commissioners basically saying, listen, if this doesn't go well, it's not us, it's commission counsel that aren't asking the right questions. So don't blame us, blame our lawyers. That whole story. So the other witnesses that were mentioned today, I'll just go through quickly, that will be appearing are Constable Greg Wiley, who has had many visits with Gabriel Wortman, I think 15 or 16 over the course of a couple of years. Constable Troy Maxwell, Miss Brenda Forbes, who was a former neighbor who witnessed was told about domestic violence, spoke to Miss Banfield about domestic violence that she was suffering at the hands of Wortman, spoke to the police about his weapons, and of course nothing happened as a result of that. So we'll get her perspective on that. She's spoken to some media organizations and given her story already. We're also going to read about Corporal Rodney Peterson's account. Corporal Peterson, you may recall, was the officer who crossed paths with Wortman, noticed that he had the push bar in the front of his vehicle, radioed that was the case, and then took 1.2 kilometers before turning around to come back and try to catch him. And by that time, Wortman had driven into the Fisher's driveway and wasn't captured at that time. Was driving south towards the Masstown Market interchange there. So we're not going to hear from Corporal Peterson. We'll just get a sworn affidavit. So it's unclear how extensive those questions will be. Now, that brings us to some of the actual events of today. There were two expert panels, as I mentioned. These suffer as other expert panels have suffered by the fact that none of them actually commented comment on anything that actually took place during the events of the mass casualty. These are just broad introductions to the stated topics. There's a lot of sort of stating of the obvious. Anybody who's thought about the needs of first responders following a mass casualty incident would have come up with many of the same things that these experts have. If you thought about rural communities, how policing and crime is different in a rural community versus an urban center, you would have thought of many of the same points that were being raised today in the commission. Hard to imagine many more than 3 people, being the 3 commissioners themselves, listening that attentively to what the experts were saying. They were, though, I'll tell you who the experts were, because there's an interesting pattern here. Dr. Arija Beers from the Trillium Health Partners, based out of Calgary, I believe. Robin Campbell, who was a PhD candidate at Dalhousie. Dr. Julie McMillan Devlin, who was head of the Operational Stress Injury, which is a Veterans Affairs affiliated operation in New Brunswick. Mary Fetchett, who we heard from a couple of days ago with the 9/11 support group out of New York. Dr. Alexandra Haber, who was the Veterans Affairs Chief of Psychiatry, National Chief of Psychiatry. I'll come back to her in a moment. She was involved briefly, but kind of significantly, in the Desmond inquiry. Dr. Megan McKelleran, who we heard from a few days ago as well, from the Waveford Mental Health Group. And Dr. Deborah Norris, who's a professor at Mount St. Vincent. All right. Dr. Heber was criticized in the Desmond inquiry by the family. She and a few others had come down from Ottawa to speak and meet with the family. And when they did so, they came down in November, and it was right around Corporal Desmond's, what would have been Corporal Desmond's birthday. And none of them knew that or had that information given to them. But at that meeting with the family, they said, if any of you need to call the assistance line, need some mental health support, counseling, it'll be there for you. Everybody that's taking those calls is going to know who you are, about the Desmond tragedy, all those things. And so one of Corporal Desmond's sisters, Cassandra, calls on the anniversary of the tragedy, January 5th, and January 5th, 2018, the first anniversary, and nobody had any idea who she was. So that really didn't materialize the way Dr. Heber had promised. So that was just a further example of a bureaucracy dropping the ball. So we're seeing a lot of that in the RCMP and actually the Mass Casualty Commission itself, this bureaucratic, overly bureaucratic organization where proper decisions can't be made without over-reliance on procedure. Okay. The other afternoon panel was led by Dr. Emma Cunliffe from the Mass Casualty Commission, featured Dr. Karen Foster from Dalhousie, Dr. Jane McMillan from St. FX, who was married to Donald Marshall significantly and spoke about the Marshall inquiry son. Very interesting lady. Superintendent Dan Morrow, who's the head of the Southwest Nova District of the RCMP, Dr. Anna Suhami from the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Rosemary Riccardelli from Memorial University, Dr. Rick Rodell from the University of Regina, and Dr. Sigma Dom Shanks from the University of Ottawa. A lot of doctors there, all PhDs or candidates for the most part, 80-90% of them. Just reminded me of an old joke that the former principal here in Goshby used to tell. He was a science degrees, had a PhD. Somebody asked him what the letters after his name stood for. He said, well, you know what BS is? Yes. Well, MS is more of the same, and PhD is piled higher and deeper. So we certainly heard the language of, trauma, PTSD, rural community differentiation, all of these things through the witnesses, but not a lot of insight. So we'll see if anything of significance comes from that in the commissioner's reports. But the main news out of today was the witnesses forthcoming for the summer. We will hear from Lisa Banfield in a very truncated and, in my view, inappropriately truncated manner. We'll hear from the other witnesses, the police witnesses. Presumably, they'll be subject to cross-examination. We didn't hear anything today about requested accommodations or anything of that nature. So, that was day 42 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. Some interesting news out of today. We'll be back next week, I believe either Tuesday or Wednesday, for proceedings after the long weekend. And so otherwise, enjoy the long weekend. Today was a grading day here in Nova Scotia. Looks like the Mass Casualty Commission and the RCMP are hoping for what will be, I guess it's called a social grade, where everybody passes. But I think the people evaluating their performance are going to be a little tougher, and it's going to be difficult for them to get through this with a passing grade. So we'll until then, until next week, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.